Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today is going to be a little bit of a different video. I wanted to do something a little bit more entertaining and a little bit less tutorial-esque, so I hope you guys like it. I wanted to do a video on tier lists and the tools that I use for sound designing and how I would rank them one against another. So the idea is to take these different tools and rank them based on how useful they are, how easy they are to use, and also how inspiring and unique their functionality is. Before we get into it, I quickly want to say I'm setting up a Patreon. I'm not clear if it's already set up or not because I'm recording this far in advance. The idea is that these videos that I'm recording now are going to be coming up first on Patreon a few days before you actually see it on YouTube. So for the people who support me, they get early access to videos along with a whole bunch of different perks. I am still planning on, once it's all set up, do a video going through that. And if my Patreon is already out, that video should already be on my channel. If not, then it might not yet be there. So then, without further ado, let's get right into this tier list. So here I have 20 pictures, and the idea for those who don't know what a tier list is that we have 5 slots where we can rate them, from S tier being the best, and then A, B, C, and D going down below worse and worse and worse. So I just want to get started with the first one and kind of talk a little bit about each of the plugins, what they're useful for, and how often I use them and what specific cases that I use them. So this first plugin that I sometimes use, not very often, is called Lux, L-U-X-E. It is created by a company called Clef Grant, and their plugins are fairly simple. They have very few controls, but they do a very specific job and they tend to do them very well. They're very unique often. There's ideas in the plugins that aren't really something that you come across a lot. But this plugin is kind of like an enhancer. There are 2 enhancer algorithms and they just are supposed to make sounds better with saturation and all other kinds of like magic under the hood. But the problem here is that you don't have enough control to really dial in a tone that you really like. At least not for me. You just have the 2 modes that you can select and then the amount of like processing that it does to the signal. And for me, that's not really enough. So what I find is that I try this plugin on a few different sounds and 50 to 40% of the time it just works and it's nice. And other times I just remove it again and have to find something else. So for that reason, I'm gonna give it C tier. And that means that we're just going to put it here. So you can see it's in C tier. The next plugin is called Panna. It's also by Clef Grant. And this is a panning algorithm. But the interesting thing about this is it gives you the idea of panning without actually panning something. So the levels or the volumes of the 2 different channels don't actually change. They stay relatively similar. But it still gives you a panning effect. And the way it does this is, I believe, a combination with comb filters and the Haas effect. With that, it does change the tone of your sound a little bit. But the main thing that it does is it makes it actually sound like the sound is coming from one ear as opposed to the other, without changing the difference in volume between the 2 channels. So this is a very interesting plugin. It does something very specific. And often I find myself more using auto panning or something like that, but what I'll do is I'll have a little bit of auto panning on it and then use an LFO to modulate the main panning of this plugin. So it's like a combination of both effects, which gives this really cool wide panning sound without being it too extreme in the actual volume difference that you get. So for that reason, I'm going to give this a B tier because it's very useful, but only in very limited amount of cases. The next plugin is Vital, and to be quite honest, I don't use Vital quite enough for my liking. I wish I was using it more. I have been getting into it more and more and forcing myself to use it more and more, but I still rely a lot on Serum, and I feel like a lot of the things that Vital does, Serum also does, and for me, I'm just faster in Serum because I've been using it for 3 years now, 4 years, maybe even longer at this point. I don't really know when I got it. I didn't get it right away when it came out. But I have had Serum for a long, long time. But especially lately, what I found is that for really crazy sound design, if you want to do something really crazy inside a synth, that Vital is a little bit more forgiving and a little bit, it allows you to just do more before it actually breaks completely. To give you an example of what I mean, if you go into Serum and you set a very specific delay time so that delay is equal to the key of whatever sound that you're creating, then often what I hear with Serum is that it kind of gets slightly out of tune. So the timings there for very, very, very fast delays are not really precise enough to be able to do that. Whereas with Vital, you are just able to do that. The only problem I have right now is that I cannot set LFO rates in Hertz mode. You kind of get around it with a seconds mode, but you need to do another calculation if you have a Hertz value in mind that you want to target. So for those reasons, I am going to give it an S tier. If there was like an S minus tier in here, then I would give it an S minus because of that one problem that I talked about before, as well as the fact that I haven't really used it that much yet. So I haven't really gotten to know it as well as I do, for example, Serum or Faceplant. But it's still a very powerful synth, therefore it deserves an S tier. Next up is VCV Rack. Now most of you know VCV Rack as a standalone application for modular synthesis, but actually VCV Rack 2, the second version, is actually a VST plugin version. It does cost money now, it's no longer free if you want the VST plugin. If you still only want the standalone, there is still a free version of that available, also the version 2. But as I said, there's no VST version of that. So for the VST version, you do have to pay. The real power of this VCV Rack is also a little bit its downfall, and that's the fact that there are so many modules available. I really want to get into this synth, but just researching what each model does just takes so much time that any inspiration that I might have for a sound is long gone by the time that I actually get to set up a patch. I do have to give it to VCV Rack that the potential is massive. There is no synth that does, there's not really any other synth right now that does everything that VCV Rack can do with its humongous library of modules. So for that reason, I am going to give it an A tier, just because, as I said, it is also a little bit of a limitation having to learn your way through this massive library of modules before you can effectively use them. Now next up we have Serum. Now this is a little bit of a no-brainer for me because Serum has been my main synth for many, many years now. As I said, I am really quick in here. All of the bass lines that I make for different tracks, I make them in Serum. I don't think I've ever made a production where the bass line was not made in Serum for everything I do here on Projektor, including the stuff that is yet to release. So that just goes to show how much I trust this plugin and how much I know my way around this plugin. So for that reason, I have to give it an S tier. The next plugin to talk about here is Omnisphere 2. And Omnisphere, I really use it more as a preset browser rather than a sound design tool per se, in the sense that I don't really go in and make my own patches. But what I've found is that for a lot of these patches, what I usually do is that I can start off with a patch, record it, and then manipulate anything that I record out of Omnisphere. And for that massive patch library and that massive library of sounds that you have at your disposal for that, coupled with the fact that the sounds that come out of Atmosphere really are well suited for this kind of processing. For example, the granular resampling that I often do with the sampler works really well on the sounds that come outside of Omnisphere because they have such a rich texture. My only complaint about Omnisphere is that it's very CPU intensive, even if it's not loaded. What that means is if I create a sound and I have it play a MIDI track and then I close the actual plugin, it still looks to me like it's keeping the GUI open somehow because I cannot actually see a drop in CPU usage. And normally with other heavy plugins, when you close the GUI, what happens is that a lot of the stuff that is not really necessary gets unloaded. That just doesn't seem to happen with Omnisphere 2, or it happens in the wrong way, or it's just too intense for my CPU, whatever, I don't know. But for that reason, I am going to have to give it a B tier. Now next on the list is Oden II. Now fans of this channel might remember Oden II because I have done a few videos on them. I believe I've done 2 videos on Oden II. It's a free plugin and it's made by the Wave Warden, which is, I think, a single person company who does smaller plugins like this. So Oden II is a fairly simplistic synth, but it has some really cool filter properties in the sense that it has some really unique filter types and it lends itself well for more analog modeling filters. What I have found is that I don't really like the modulation system in there, and I don't really have a use for it in the sense that there's no specific sound that I want to create that I kind of need to go to Odin for. So for that reason, I have to score this a little bit lower on the list because I don't see really one single reason that I would need to launch this plugin. There is not something that I often want to do that just requires Oden II. So for this one, I'm going to go with a C tier. Next up is Faceplant. This is a little bit more of a modular approach to the hybrid synth, the hyper synth, or whatever you want to call it, the big synth. just like Serum and Vital, these are the synths that are capable of almost any sound that you want to make. And Faceplant, for me, what I've been doing a lot with it is very complex FM setups with, say, 5 to 7, 8 oscillators, something like that. And what I've found is that for those kind of things, you can really, looking at the waveforms, craft the kind of tone that you want. And then using macros and using different processors, you can really shape it the way you want. Faceplant is very visual. It gives you a lot of visual feedback of what you're actually doing to the sound. And therefore, I really, really like it. Especially for the Atmosphere pack that I've been doing. I've been using that quite a lot. The idea of having different macros control different FM amounts and then just modulating the FM to have this constantly shifting tone is what created a lot of the different atmospheres in that pack. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in S tier where it belongs, just with the other two big synths that I use. You can really do anything you want with Faceplant and also the other two, so I think it's just logical that they all should be up there. Now the next plugin is very, very special and I don't think a lot of you know it. It's called Dear VR Micro by Dear Reality. And the idea is that within our stereo sound, you're still able to three-dimensionally play sounds around your head and up and down. And this plugin allows you to control that. So it's a really unique, kind of similar to Panna, which I talked about before, in the sense that it's this panning stereo placement tool that you not often use, but when you use it, it's this very specific kind of stereo placement that you get out of it. And therefore, I think it's the same as Panna in that it's a very situational tool for if you want to pan something or if you want to move something around in a stereo field. What I've often been doing with this plugin is to just take the main knob that does the degree on what degree you want it around your head, because that's kind of what it's doing. It's saying, okay, where around your head do you want the sound to be placed in degrees? And what I do with that is I just modulate it to go around and around, and that creates some really cool sounds. So just because it's so specific and it basically does the same thing as Panna, but only in a different way, I'm going to place it again in B tier. Next up with Isotope Trash 2. And I've got this plugin a little while ago when it was on sale actually for free, when Isotope and Native Instruments kind of merged in this alliance collaborative plugin company or plugin alliance. It's not now one company, but they have like an alliance between the two companies. And for that reason, they celebrated by releasing this for free together with some Native Instrument plugins as well. But since that I've gotten it, haven't really found a specific use for it. For me, what I found is that the distortion is quite easy to get very, very extreme. And in those cases, it's really hard to control. So this is generally more suited for more distorted sound designing than what I usually do. So for that reason, I am going to give it a D tier because it's not really useful for me. Even though I got it for free, I haven't really been able to get the tones out of it that I really want. Now, just as a reminder, just because something is in D tier for me doesn't mean that it has to be for you as well. It might be that for you, a plugin that is in D tier for me works really well for you, and something that is in S tier for me might not work at all for you. The idea behind this video is just to give you an idea of how I work and give you a little bit more insight in what the plugins are that I actually use and how I actually use them. The next plugin you might not recognize as well. This is a plugin by The Usual Suspects called DSP56300E. And it's a little bit of a strange name, but what it does is it actually emulates a virus model C, I believe, either C or model A. I think you can load both of those models in there. What you actually need to do is you need to provide it a ROM for one of those two models, so it actually emulates the exact same way that an actual virus would do that, an access virus, which is a hardware synth. So for that reason, it's very specific. It's also a very cool sound. So because of that, it is very, very true to the original. Actually, it's the same software running on there, only that you don't have the tactical feedback of an actual virus synth. But what I found is that the GUI doesn't really work for me. There's still a lot of issues with it. And that might be because it's just been released and it's not released that long ago. Also, I found it to be very complex to just use in terms of loading presets, initializing presets, those kind of things are still very, very traditionally done, in the sense that, for example, to get an initialized preset. There is no button like you would have in a normal plugin with initialized preset, but you have to go inside one of the banks, find an initialized preset there, and then work from there. So for that reason, and for the fact that I haven't been using it that much since I got it, I'm going to put it in C tier. The next tool that I want to talk about is LFO tool. And it's obviously a tool. What it's mainly used for is sidechaining, but what I've also found is that it's very useful for transgating, because you can draw in the curve that you want. And sometimes I even use it for creative filtering. If I want to filter something on an LFO, then LFO tool is the best way to do it, because it has an included filter. The only real complaint that I have is that it's very prone to getting clicks. Now the reason for that is because it's very accurate to the curve, so that's actually kind of a good thing, in the sense that it stays very accurate to the curve that you draw in. It doesn't do any smoothing on that or something like that. But that's something that you need to be aware of. It also, for me personally, can get out of time really easily if I use any plugins that massively increase the plugin delay before I use LFO tool. Now this is more a limitation with Ableton than the plugin itself, because Ableton's plugin delay compensation does not take into account the actual trigger that it sends to time sync different plugins to the project. What that means is that I manually have to reset the timing within LFO tool to actually start using it correctly. So for that reason, I'm going to give it an A tier. It's not the plugin's fault that it does that, but it's just an annoying little thing with the fact that I'm using Ableton. Next up is Little Alter Boy. And Little Alter Boy is a formant and pitch shifter in real time. And it's a really cool plugin, but what I found is that it's very easy to destroy your sound. What I've found, for example, is that if you play it on that, there's this weird thing that it does, in that it phases the left and the right channel, and therefore at one moment you're going to have a very stereo sound, and in the next moment you're going to have a completely mono sound, and it just kind of modulates between those two extremes. Therefore, it's very prone to destroying your sound in other ways than just by pitch shifting it or formant shifting it. So you have to be very careful with it. And for that reason, I'm going to have to give it a C tier. If they ever come around and fix that part of the plugins, if they make it a little bit better sounding, then I might upgrade this to an A tier or maybe even an S tier, because it's a really powerful tool when it's working properly. But there's just a lot of problems with it like that make it for me that it's just not exactly what I need from a formant shifter or pitch shifter. The next plugin is also a formant shifter and pitch shifter. This is M Transformer. And M Transformer is one of the most powerful plugins that I own, in the sense that it allows you to remap any frequency to any other frequency. The byproduct is that it sounds either very glitchy or that it requires a lot of processing power to do what it needs to do, and therefore also has a lot of plugin delay. So it's a very cool creative effect. You can really mangle up sounds and completely change them if you want to, but it's a very strong plugin, and it also introduces a lot of artifacts if you're using very extreme settings. But it's still a very powerful tool that I use maybe not enough. So for that reason, I am going to give it a B tier. The next plugin again is from Soundtoys, and it's called Ego Boy Jr. Again, with the boy here, I think they just like to name their plugins after small boys. I don't know what that's about, but okay. This is a delay unit. It's a simplified version of their Echo Boy standard plugin, hence the junior appendix to the plugin name. What this plugin does really well is that it limits the settings that you have just so that you can focus on dialing in the delay that you want. There's no really crazy parameters that you can dial in, what the normal Echo Boy does have. I don't have the normal Echo Boy, so I actually don't exactly know how in-depth you can go, but I've heard that you can do a lot more with that plugin. But for me, up until now, this plugin has been enough, and I've used it in quite a lot of different songs, and I used it on quite a lot of different sounds. It's a very cool delay unit, and it sounds very, very nice. So for that reason, I'm going to give it an A tier. Next up, we have H Reverb by Waves. And Waves often has sales, and for me what I do is I often look through their sales if there are any interesting plugins. And this was one of the interesting plugins that I found, because it looked like a very, very complex reverb plugin. And indeed it is. It is very complex, and you can do a lot of different things with it. You can really dial in whatever reverb that you want. It's very fast in terms of dialing in the reverb that you want. I also own Turbo Reverb by Melda Production, which is also one of these very complex reverb plugins, even more complex to be honest. But what I found there is that it's quite slow into dialing in exactly the reverb that you want. So for the cases where I need to really get into the details of what my reverb should sound like, I like to use H reverb. The only problem is that I like to use all of my reverbs and delays as inserts. I know that's not the best, but I don't like working with return tracks. And H reverb tends to use a lot of CPU. So for that reason, I'm going to give it a B tier, just because it hoards so much of your CPU that having a few instances of this plugin makes it almost impossible to work within the plugin with my current setup. Next up is Vitamin. This is also made by Waves, and I also picked it up on a sale when it was $30 or something. Ever since I discovered this plugin, I've been using it on all of my bass lines because it's this really cool low-end enhancer. It enhances the full spectrum if you want to, but what I found is that it really works well for the low end. And the reason for that is that the crossover filters are made in such a way that the phasing that it brings into a sound is particularly nice. So for that reason, I've been using it a lot on my bass lines as of late. And it's just very powerful to dial in some extra power to the low end or the lower mids, or even sometimes the high end. It also works. So for the reason that I actually cannot really go without it on my bass lines anymore, I am also going to give this one an S tier. Next up is Supermassive by Valhalla. And Supermassive is this reverb delay kind of crossover. You can use it as a delay, you can use it as a reverb, because it has this warping function that kind of warps from a delay to a reverb kind of sound. And it's a really cool plugin in the sense that it creates ambient sounds that you're not really capable with either a delay or a reverb. It kind of sits in between if you don't set it to either 100% or 0. For that reason, it's a really cool kind of ambience that it gives. So because of that, I am going to give it an A tier. So let's just drag it over there. Next up, we have Space Modulator, and this is actually a flanger unit. And even though it works really well as a flanger, I am not really using this a lot. I've used it a few times though. It is a free plugin, so it's not like I'm sad about not using it that much, but what I found is that I just cannot really get the sounds out of it like I wanted to. I might need to spend a little bit more time on it. Even though it's a very simplistic plugin, I feel like diving really deep into it and starting to use it maybe a bit more, I can get some crazy sounds out of it that I do like. So just for the fact that I don't use it very much, I am going to give it a C tier. So just because I don't use it too much and I cannot really get the tones out of it, I am going to give it a D tier. So now we've come to the final plugin, which is Psyscope. And Psyscope is this oscilloscope which is tied to the timing of your track, so tied to the beat of your track. And this is more of a utility plugin rather than a generator or an effect. But it's still very, very powerful, and I use it always for looking at my kicks and bass and the waveform of them. So for that reason, I am going to give it an A tier. Even though it doesn't do any sound designing per se, it's still a very, very useful tool to have. And I would recommend you grab at least the free version. There's also a pro version, but you don't have to use that. The free version works just fine. So this is my tier list. I hope I could give you a little bit of insight on how I think of these plugins, and I hope I could explain a little bit on how I use them. It's not the most detailed video, I know. If there's any plugins that you would want me to break down or explain a little bit more about, then I would be happy to do so. Just leave a comment about that and I can get that done. But this is going to be the video for today. I do still hope that you enjoyed the video, even though it's a little bit different. If you want me to make more of these videos, you can show your appreciation by giving me a like. That way I can see that you enjoyed this video, obviously, and I can cater a little bit more to this type of video. If you are new here and you find my content interesting, there's going to be a playlist of all my tutorials at the end of this video. But if you don't want to miss any of my tutorials, I suggest you subscribe, and you can even turn on the bell notifications by clicking the little bell icon, and then YouTube will send you a message whenever I upload something. Finally, I want to say, if you want to support me financially, you can do so by going to the description and buying my products. I have products that I make, and if you're interested in the products, then you actually get something for your financial support. If you just want to send me money, that's also okay. You can go to my website and you can find a donation link there as well. And if my Patreon is already ready, then there will also be a link in the description for that. But that's going to be the video. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.